So, look, this case is seen as being linked to Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou's fight in a Canadian court against a US extradition request. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, what we saw back in December 2018 is the Canadian government arrested Ms. Meng Wanzhou, a Huawei executive, for suspected dishonesty with regards to some of dealings with HSBC having to do with Iran. And as a reciprocation for Canada's arrest of Ms. Meng, two Canadians were arrested, Michael Kovrig, former diplomat, and Michael Spavro, a businessman. And what we've seen over the past 2 years is both sides digging in. The Canadian side saying that this has been a rule of law process, that Ms. Meng will follow, will be entitled to the privileges and the protection under Canadian law until a decision has been made. And what we've seen on the Chinese side is, again, the practice of what we call hostage diplomacy, the arrest of two Canadians and I think false charges put against them. And what we've seen just last week is Michael Spavro received an 11-year very harsh sentence for charges. And this is basically to set up the pressure on the Canadian side to perhaps influence the decision-making process within the independent courts in Canada. And of course, this won't happen. We have a strong separation of the political system and the legal system in Canada, like Australia, and this will make it very difficult for us to shift a position that's outside the legal context.
Yeah, okay. What have you made of the way that Canada has actually handled these matters and broader ties with Beijing over the past 2.5 years?
Well, I think in general, the Canadian government has not been as adept as it could have been in terms of managing these bilateral relations. I think that it needs to learn from neighboring countries of China of how to manage these issues. And usually it's behind door diplomacy. And this behind doors diplomacy is where they hammer out potential solutions and creative processes to download or to diffuse the tensions between both states. And that hasn't happened. I think Canada has gone through a process of naming and shaming, and this naming and shaming process just does not work. Second, I think that Canada is very much a bystander in a broader, deepening rivalry between China and the United States. And China is definitely wanting to send a signal to allies and partners of the United States, in particular Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and others, that if it crosses any red lines that Beijing feels is going to affect its national interest vis-a-vis bilateral relations with the United States, that it will come down hard. And we've seen that in terms of the hostage diplomacy and economic coercion against Canada. But we've also seen it towards Australia and South Korea and other countries. And I think this is the broader big picture that we should be thinking about, and what middle powers like Canada and Australia should be thinking about when we are engaging with China. How does our decisions reflect Beijing's broader strategies and tactics in terms of dealing with the United States? And there's an expression in China kill the chickens to scare the monkeys. And in this case, the Canadians are the chickens, and the Chinese are wanting to make sure that other allies and friends of the United States understand what are the consequences of crossing Beijing's red lines.
Yeah, okay. It's been well publicised, the deterioration in relations between Australia and China. China has hit Australia with numerous economic sanctions. So has that also been the case with Canada?
Well, this is the China paradox. I think both Australia and Canada have a similar challenge. We have, our relations are perhaps the lowest point since normalization between China and Australia, China and Canada, but our trade relations are up. And actually, since the COVID pandemic, our trade relations have actually deepened with China. And this creates a challenge for our governments, both in Canberra and Ottawa. How do we manage these political tensions when our trading relations continue to deepen? Just last year, the Canadians exported more agricultural products and more unprocessed iron ore. And if you look at Australia, it's very, very similar, except in very targeted areas like wine, barley, and beef. So we really need to be rethinking how we deal with this particular challenge of China, because that trading relations is going to be there as China continues to grow and as middle class demands products from our countries. But we have to also be really conscious of the political challenge that we're going to be faced as China and the United States really start to intensify their competition, and China tries to find ways to weaken the United States and its broader security and diplomatic partnerships within the region.
Yeah, okay. Do we know how relations with China are currently playing into the election campaign in Canada? Is there bipartisanship? Is there support from opposition parties for the way that Justin Trudeau and his government have actually handled relations?
Well, I think at the grassroots of society, the favorability ratings of China in Canada are at the lowest they've really been. And this is broadly framing, I think, the debate in Canada. And it's an unhealthy debate because I think that many, both on the liberal side and the conservative side in the Canadian context, are trying to find a way to take a harder line in China. But they understand that to take a harder line in China may affect our trading relationships with China. So the debate, I don't think, is as evolved as it could be. It's not as nuanced as it could be. And we really need to start to find ways to multiple tracks to improve our relationship with China, and somehow isolate or work on these more difficult areas in behind doors diplomatic ways, so that it doesn't affect the broader relationship. And this is, of course, this challenged relationship and how we're thinking about it in terms of the upcoming election in Canada and how we frame our relations with China is in the broader debate. How is China and the United States moving forward in terms of the relationship? And at this stage under the Biden administration, it seems to have hardened its positions vis-a-vis China. And that means countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, Japan are going to have to think very, very carefully how they balance their long-standing and comprehensive partnership with the United States, but of course, important economic relationship with China that we all want to benefit from.
Yeah, okay. Can I also just ask you about the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, the Taliban's takeover, and how China is navigating, or how you expect China to navigate the Taliban's return? I'm not sure if this is something that you're following closely.
Well, frankly, I think that the Beijing is very worried about the sudden change in power in Afghanistan. The Taliban, of course, have extremist roots, and China is very concerned about those extremists percolating into Chinese territory and potentially stirring up extremism in Xinjiang, where there's already huge problems in terms of re-education camps of the Uyghurs and fears about separatism, extremism, and terrorism emanating out of Xinjiang. Beijing also is worried about the broader impact that some kind of downward spiral in governance in Afghanistan could affect its Belt Road Initiative, both in potentially in Afghanistan, but the spillover in Pakistan. And Pakistan is kind of a key area, I think, when we're thinking about China and the Belt Road Initiative. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as it's called, features the BRI projects, and it's really the signature project for Beijing. If this doesn't work in Pakistan, arguably China's best friend in the region, is not going to work anywhere. So Beijing is looking at it from interest point of view. How could deterioration in the situation in terms of governance in Afghanistan could become a terrorist challenge for China? But how can it affect its signature initiatives that are tied to the Communist Party of China, tied to Xi Jinping's legitimacy, and tied to China's broader strategic interests into reshaping the region so it favors Chinese interests, values, and forms of governance?
Okay, Stephen Nagy, as always, very much appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us here today on Ticker News.
Thanks very much, Jackson. We'll see you again.